These tapes, I hope, are for West Virginians, because they're by a West Virginian, myself, by an Appalachian. But all the great things in my life have happened, and some of the terrible ones have happened in Appalachia. I was born here, came to a realization of what I wanted to be here, a writer, and I was almost killed in Appalachia. I was coming from Detroit to Philadelphia through the Alleghenies near Altoona. The train went off the track, went down a 300-foot bank and killed 25 people and injured 150. Well, I got a bad finger out of it. It's a stiff, and I can type faster now than I could before. People ask me why I had the finger, since I had my choice of having it stiff this way or stiff straight. I always tell them it's just not going to look too great. You come in a room and say, "Hi guys," you know. So I figured I would have it this way better. It was one of the most horrible experiences of my life, that train wreck, and for years I tried to get it down on paper. I've tried since, and I never could do it. I never could get that feeling out beyond fear, which is such terror that you become very quiet, very calm, and think of how you may best save your life. But years later, I think some of the terror that I managed to get into Night of the Hunter and a few of my short stories came out of that experience. Oftentimes, the artistic process has a curious way of translating experiences into a kind of a myth. I think that's probably the whole meaning of what art is, and possibly the whole concept of the resurrection of an idea after the crucifixion of it in the artist's mind. I had a friend in Moundsville back in the 40s who taught art at Princeton, Jimmy Davis. He told me once about as an example of this strange metamorphosis in our minds. He told about a painter who'd been in the South in the early 30s, in a little southern town on a hot August afternoon, when it seems there's nothing in the world but locusts and a few rain crows down on the bayou. But a mob started to run, and he ran with them. And the first thing he knew, he, a liberal, decent American, was in a lynch mob. And he went along just as he was kind of like a leaf is carried by a current, not as part of the instrument of horrible civic Christian vengeance, which the charade they were acting out seemed to be to them, but just because he was fascinated by some huge and terrible human movement, like a little piece of war itself, or hate acted out on a road or a field. And he went home to his studio and he tried to paint. He tried to paint what he'd seen. And everything was there. The poor man strapped to a lighter pine, being drenched with Texaco and set on fire. And the crowd, in a kind of a horrible Robert Altman effect, was singing Bye Bye Blackbird. And nothing was real in the painting. Nothing of the terror, nothing of the horror, nothing of the human revulsion came across in that painting. He tried it many times. Then one day, years later, my friend Jim Davis came into this man's studio and was looking around, and he saw a still life of a country store, the counter, the scales, a barrel of prunes, some dusty onions and potatoes, a window with yellow summer light coming through, cobwebs and dust, and the stains of old rains on the glass. And the glass was kind of wrinkled, the way the light wrinkles in moments of terror. And my friend Jim Davis looked at this painting and he said the effect of it was so horrible, and yet so remote from its theme. A few onions, a couple of dead flies, the way the light fell on a floor that was worn by the feet of generations. And without knowing it, he had captured all the terror and the revulsion of that lynch scene. Pardon me, as I say, in an apparently unrelated theme. So I think that in a curious way, every beating I got on the schoolyard in Moundsville, and Delmas Miller told, I think it was Bob Murphy, the librarian of the West Virginia University medical department. It's true, because I was kind of a funny, lonely kid, and never fitted in with the general, the ball playing thing. I never got good grades in school, and I was just sort of a sore thumb on the whole hand of the town. And yet, as I look back on that, I used to think that every child who shows any glimmer of talent ought to be put into a special school where his talents are nurtured and tended, and where every creative seed is watered and fertilized by kind, skilled hands. And I know that if that had been the kind of education and childhood I'd had, I wouldn't have become a writer. I wouldn't have had the thing that Blake calls contrarieties, at least as I understand it. I wouldn't have had the plus and minus which must exist in all nature before there can be any energy. I wouldn't trade my West Virginia childhood for the childhood of a king in some opulent land 1,000 years ago. Because in a way I had that too. I was the king of a foreign land in my backyard. I was anything I wanted to be. Tom Mix, Ken Maynard, Lon Chaney, all the movie heroes that I watched in those days, including glimpses of Lillian Gish, little knowing that in the 1920s at the Strand Theater or the Park, I was looking at a lady who would someday act out an image from my mind in a movie which I understand is as dear to her as it is to me. She's 83 now. Well, it isn't nice to tell a lady's age, except when she reaches such a distinguished one, and is able to dance and sing in a Broadway musical as she did 3 years ago. I never knew many of the people in my movies. I've only had 2 movies made, Night of the Hunter and Fool's Parade, which some of you tonight, as you're looking at this tape, may remember having a party in Moundsville. It was all like a big, wonderful party, as I remembered. I came down and created something of a legend. I didn't mean to, a joke at least, by bringing my small dog, Rowdy Charlie, with me in a taxi cab. Because my small dog, Rowdy Charlie, was my best friend. He and my brother, Lou, who was the one closest to me on earth, even though he's in New York right now. And I'm trying to coax him to come back here with these people, as I am. But I wanted Rowdy Charlie to sniff around in the backyard where I first saw a blade of grass, and maybe take a leak against a tree that I played under, and he did. And it cost me $700 to get him down here in a cab and back. And a lot of people have laughed about that since, but I would do that again. Because I feel such a connection with that little piece of backyard. in Moundsville. I remember in 1921 or 22, being out in the backyard one day, and suddenly I heard a sound like 1,000 motorcycles coming slowly approaching. I was frightened. I knew that something unearthly was happening. I lay down on my back on the grass, spread eagle, and stared up at the sky. And suddenly around the corner of the horizon came the dirigible Shenandoah on one of her last flights before the terrible crash, destruction of the dirigible out near Cambridge, Ohio, in 1924. And I think I thought it was God's own phallus. I saw this enormous silver thing in the sky, and it was one of the great religious experiences of my 3 years. Because the Shenandoah and the Macon and the Akron and the Macon, the Shenandoah, the Akron, and the Los Angeles were all the big Navy dirigibles in those days. And they used to fly from Lakehurst, New Jersey, to either Akron or Dayton. I'm not sure which. I think it was Akron. I'm not sure, but I remember the commander of the Shenandoah was Commander Lansdowne. And I heard stories and read and talked to people that the dirigible got caught I'm using this scene in my forthcoming book, what I'm working on, called Bliss. So I'm thinking, it's in my mind, it's something fresh. I remember the dirigible went out against Lansdowne's wishes, and he registered this protest with the Navy Department by phone or wire, and said that Ohio and that part around Cambridge is notorious for line storms around that time of year, in September. I'm sure it was in September. And the Navy said, the heck with that, like, go on out and do your thing. So he went and died with his crew, most of it. The dirigible was twisted in half by this powerful storm, and half of it was hurled up 14,000 feet in the air with the men hanging on to the girders and looking down through an open bag of the dirigible. One of the most terrifying predicaments I can ever imagine being in. And yet some of these men survived. And it was impossible for the Navy or for the National Aeronautics men to find sufficient parts of that dirigible to really determine if it had failed structurally or what had happened. Because the people in that region stripped every bit of fabric from what wreckage was there. They wrenched the Annapolis gold graduating ring from the hand of the dead commander, which always seemed to be one of the most gruesome bits of grave robbing that I've ever heard of. So that the memories of the great dirigibles in the 30s are just as strong in my mind as the memories of another kind of transportation, which is equally delightful, I'm told, and that's the river packet. I went down the river from Moundsville, from Wheeling to Cincinnati with my mother on the Queen City, one of the really custom-built packets of the Ohio trade. She was in the Pittsburgh, Louisville trade. And I remember talking just the other day, night before last, to a marvelous man over in Point Pleasant. I was over there. Delightful people. Love Point Pleasant. Captain Charlie Stone, who's a great friend of Captain Fred Way, who lives at Sewickley, Pennsylvania, and who should be considered an Appalachian because he is the world's greatest authority on steamboats. The great steamboats were the ones built, the really fine steamboats were built on the Ohio River by the Howard Shipyard at Jeffersonville, Indiana. They weren't built on the Mississippi, not the really great boats. I don't know where the Queen City was built, but I know the Natchez, and I think the Robert E. Lee were both built by the Howard Yards at in Indiana at Jeffersonville. In those days, according to Captain Stone and others, a bunch of men would get together some capital to start a steamboat, to own it jointly, collectively. And they'd go into Mr. Howard or his brother and say, we want such and such, we want to spend $10,000 on the salon ceiling, we want mirrors at the end of the salon, we want a Steinway piano or a Steve or whatever. And there were no plans drawn up for these old boats. They never had plans for them. They just would build them with love and the kind of care and journeyman craftsmanship, the skill and the great love of minute detail that you see occasionally in marvelous, well, you see them all over West Virginia, in Sistersville, in Philippi, in Clarksburg, these gorgeous steamboat Gothic houses. So that the steamboat kind of came ashore and became a part of the fixture and beauty of our state and of our sister states from the steamboat. I've heard stories and I've read where all of Wheeling stood on Wheeling Creek and laughed and jeered at a man named Shreve, whose name is kind of forgotten in the school books, who really built the steamboat as we know it. Livingston, Roosevelt, and Fulton, these men built a boat with the engines below deck, which meant that the steamboat drew an awful lot of water. And they never built a boat which could ascend the river after it got down in New Orleans. This was done by Shreve. The town of Shreveport in Louisiana is named after him. But he's largely forgotten, and we are told by our teachers in school that Fulton, Livingston, and Roosevelt and these guys invented the steamboat. Well, it's awfully hard to say who invented anything. I met and knew Thomas Alva Edison when I was a little boy up at Lake Chautauqua, which is also a part of Appalachia. And Edison is credited with the movie camera, the electric light, and the phonograph. But I know people who say, well, the phonograph was really perfected or invented by somebody in Germany, and nobody tries to take the electric light away from Edison, but a lot of people say the movie camera was not his. But I remember what he looked like, and for me, as a little boy, 8 years old at Lake Chautauqua, a lonely kid, I saw that man, and I thought he, as far as I'm concerned, he invented West Virginia. He invented the world. He was an incredibly engaging person. I remember seeing him come up the beautiful swath of grass under the trees at Lake Chautauqua one summer day in the August of 1927. The day, as I remember it, I can place it, it was the day that my father came in to our cottage from Wheeling and threw a copy of the Wheeling Telegraph on the bed, and the headline said, Rudolph Valentino, dead. But I was very lonely because there were children around, but I was kind of going my own way, and I was looking for things that I was finding from adults mostly. Because I met John D. Rockefeller that day. He was with Edison, and he terrified me. I was impressed with him, as anybody would be. He was a man of great dignity and a kind of otherworldliness, almost was like looking at Tutankhamun, the Egyptian king in his old age, or Ramesses. He wore a gray, polished sharkskin suit, a black tie, a white sensible shirt. His shoes were like black beetles. They were polished and shining. And he came up to me with great dignity on Mr. Edison's arm and said, "Boy, here's a dime." And he pressed the dime into my hand, and I was so frightened of him. And I told this story to, I don't know why, to Mrs. J. Rockefeller, the governor's lady, because I thought it was kind of amusing. I was so overwhelmed by this man that I took the dime and buried it, so that somebody plowing a field in the ruins of Lake Chautauqua 2,000 years from now will find a silver coin and never know the history of it. Up at Lake Chautauqua that same summer was the New York Symphony, it was called. It's now the New York Philharmonic. It was not the New York Philharmonic at that time. It was the New York Symphony. It was under the baton of Dr. Walter Damrosch, who was a great, great man who always did broadcasts for children, which were broadcast in Central School in Moundsville and schools all over the country. He did something like Leonard Bernstein did in the 50s on television. Music was becoming more and more a part of my writing life, and I was writing by then. I was writing little books. I would get my mother's stationery, and I'd write the story and illustrate it and run a string through it and tie it so that I had a little chapbook. And it was all coming together. It was all it was kind of like some kind of fantastic cloning, because my father had wanted to be a writer all his life. He was an architect in Wheeling, but he'd always wanted to be a writer. And I was exposed to books like I was exposed to good food. We didn't have a huge library, but we had Dickens, we had Thackeray, Balzac, de Maupassant, Rabelais, Poe, Kipling, and a few that you might laugh at, like Eugene Fields and James Whitcomb Riley. But they're part of the song of America. And Vachel Lindsay. And on this spring day, I'm thinking of a poem of Vachel Lindsay that I was hearing in my heart and mind in Point Pleasant the other day when I was looking at a field of violets sprawling down the hill like a blue carpet from the little grave of a dog named Pal. A little tombstone put up on a lot overlooking a meadow. And I had such a sense when I was walking around that meadow that I might be stepping on violets. And I'm thinking of Vachel Lindsay's poem, I want live things in their pride to remain. I will not kill one grasshopper vain. Though he gnaws a hole in my shirt like a door, I will still let him out, give him one chance more. For as he eats my shirt in his whim, grasshopper lyrics occur to him. I've often thought what a great title for a book would be, Grasshopper Lyrics. Now somebody go write that. Because that's the way sometimes a title can be born, and out of it can come a book. I've had that happen, or a story. One of my stories that's been rather popular around in collections all over the world was a story called The Horsehair Trunk that I did in Collier's back in the 40s, that grand old magazine, Collier's, which saw the first Sherlock Holmes stories in America, the great muckraking works of Lincoln Steffens first appeared in Collier's. And Collier's was my incubator, because when I left Moundsville, my mother went to Clarksburg and became a social worker with the Department of Public Assistance in the Children's Bureau, which was then headed by a marvelous woman named Catherine Lenroot in Washington. And the country was just beginning to clean up the terrible abuses of child labor, which are part of the most shameful history of all our country, and still are in parts of the world. I talked to a cab driver, when I came down to Farmington at the time of the explosion a few years ago on a bus from New York. I just wanted to be there. don't know why. It wasn't evil curiosity to see suffering. I just felt like I wanted to bring something of myself down there and see what it was like in a mine patch when there had been an explosion. And I talked to a cab driver coming out of Fairmont, and I said, you know, Monongah was the worst explosion in American history, 346 men. He said 346 at hell. It was closer to 1,000. I said, what do you mean? He says they didn't count the kids, the 7, 8, 9-year-old kids, 12, 13, because they didn't want to get in trouble. And I thought this must be a fantastic lie. It can't be. But then I remembered, I've heard miners since then say, yes, it's true. I've heard that from my folks. It didn't matter in those days. It was just, if a boy, as soon as a boy was old enough to carry his dad's lunch pail, that was it. I want to talk some more about this when I get back. And thank you, I'll be back real soon.